folks. Thank you for coming. My name is Matthew Covey. I am the founding partner at Covey Law. I'm also the executive director of Tamizdat, which is a nonprofit from which the firm grew that mostly deals with artist mobility issues around the world. This is a continuing legal education track. Is there anyone here who is an attorney who is seeking credit for being here? Awesome. Did you sign in? Okay, did you get the materials? You're all set. Okay, good. That's important. Just for the sake of our knowledge about what the audience is, what are the other people here? What other things do you do? Are you presenters? Age presenter? No. What's that? Label? Okay. A&R. Presenter? Management? Okay, what else? Label? Attorney. There we go. So did you sign in? No. You don't need to? You can. Right, that guy right there with a hat. There you go. So if you were here for the last session was really cut and dried. This is the law. This is what you need to do. This is how you get through it. This session's a lot harder, I think, because it's a much more amorphous topic. So I'm Matthew Covey,
Marla Guttman,
who's an entertainment attorney at our firm. And we're going to be talking you through some really interesting developments in contract law that have happened over the last 3 or 4 years, pretty much. Basically since the pandemic, or since just before the pandemic. And there's no piece of knowledge that we're delivering. We're talking about some changes that are happening and ways that the notion of contracts and what they can do are evolving. And that's the nature of this one. So like in the last session, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to bring them up as we go along. We know that this is a really complex and problematic topic, so work with us on this. I'm going to start by going back to, hang on, where's the clicker? There it is. There we go. I'm going to go back to a thing that happened in January 2020, just before the pandemic. There's a choreographer. We're going to start outside of the music industry and work back toward the music industry. There was a choreographer based in New York, indigenous choreographer named Emily Johnson, who in her contract, she was being commissioned by a university in New Jersey to do a performance, to choreograph and then do a performance. And she included in her contract what she called her decolonization rider. And it was a great document. If you have the packet, it's in there. From a legal standpoint, it's very challenging. It's right to the materials are at the end. The PowerPoint's at the front of the packet. The materials are at the end. It's a very challenging document, certainly from the point of view of a presenter. But it also explicitly was designed to kind of stir up trouble in how we think about the presenting of the arts and what has existed forever in terms of the contracts that underlie the relationships between artists and presenters. It was a big article in the Times that's also in your packet. And there was a whole kerfluffle. Then the pandemic came. And also in the dance world, again, this doesn't feel material to your concerns right now because it's a different art form, but bear with me. And then when the cancellations came, when all the force majeure cancellations came at the beginning of COVID, it was bad for everyone. It was bad for presenters. It was bad for promoters. It was bad for agents. It was bad for artists. But probably one of the fields that got hit worst was the field of dance. Not like club dance, but like dance companies. Because the economics of their world is that they get commissioned to do a work that's going to be performed 2 or 3 years down the line. And you start the choreography, you start the musical composition, you start casting, you start working on tech, and you do all this stuff, and you pay for it. And then you deliver the product at the end, and you get paid for it. So a force majeure cancellation to a band is not a good thing because you don't get paid for that night. But a force majeure cancellation for a dance company was disastrous because that meant that they could have been spending 2-3 years working on something and suddenly they don't get paid. So those cancellations caused a lot of trauma in the dance world and caused a lot of sort of inquiry into what are these contracts we're signing and what are we signing ourselves onto and what are the risks involved with it. And that kind of led to a broader discussion that kind of spawned off through the other arts. A discussion about what are the relationships that are at the heart of the work that we do in music or in art, and how are those relationships being dictated by the contracts we use, and what's in those contracts. And the interesting thing, following on the pandemic, of course, we were immediately hit with the fallout from the George Floyd murder, where every arts organization and every company in the country was putting out manifestos about anti-racism. But then, of course, the question that followed from that was, well, how do we put teeth into those manifestos? How do we actually take action that's related to the values that we're stating? And I think as lawyers, looking at this whole dynamic, one thing that I notice and a lot of lawyers who are working in this field notice is that it's often the lawyers who are holding it back, because you can have the aspiration, the progressive aspirations that the organization might have, but then when it goes to legal, then the lawyers are the ones saying, well, that's risky. We don't want to change the contract. The contract works the way it's always worked. We don't want to. It's risky to change it, and we're going to do what we've always done. And that dynamic is something that I think was interesting to see being discussed and interrogated. So Emily Johnson kind of lit a bomb. Pandemic showcase or pandemic cancellations, and this led to a whole series of conversations. First from the dance world, spread over into the artist presenters world, and really became a broad conversation about what's that? Click. Oh, click. Yeah, a broad conversation about the role of contracts as a tool as ethical tools within our cultural sector. If I'm listing, there's a lot more backstory here, so if you've got the packet, there you can kind of follow through a lot of the organizations that were involved with this ongoing process of trying to find ways to explore. Focus groups came together. There's an organization called Building Ethical Partnerships that was part of the APAP project, Creating New Futures. Mellon Foundation, Doris Duke Foundation got involved. Stanford Law's Transactional Law Clinic got involved with the process of trying to explore new ways of finding new ways to make contracts something that can kind of move the needle from an ethical standpoint. The purpose of this CLA is to really review some of the conversations that have been had over the last 3 years, from a high point, looking down at like what are we trying to do with the industry and how are we trying to move the practices and the best practices within the industry. That's sort of my job. Then Marla is going to do a lot of the details of that. Like, so what does that mean from a legal standpoint? How do these questions, like, it's one thing to talk about the morality and the ideals and the ethics, but how does that actually play when you're drafting a contract? I'm going to forward here. And of course, one of the things that's really core to this whole discussion is that there's a tension between, as I was mentioning, there's a tension between the way that contracts have been done, which is using language that we know, using clauses that we know, they've been litigated, they've been tried and true. And if you start to move away from those, are you moving into a territory which is possibly more ethical, but are you also moving into a territory where there's more risks involved with the use of terms that are less tested? So, so as we move toward greater transparency, as we move toward uh, more more equitable relationships and relationships between artists and presenters or agents and artists, are we creating a situation where there's more risks involved? And as the power dynamic becomes more level, does that also create situations where somebody's not going to want to take that risk because suddenly they find themselves in a riskier situation than they would have been than if they were using the old contract? So how do you navigate that? I think the top level, there we go, top level takeaways. One of the main things that came out of these discussions was a discussion about payment structures and how artists get paid and ways to make sure that we're reframing what was a transaction between an artist and a presenter or an artist and a promoter and reframe it as a relationship that's an ongoing dynamic. So that risk is being shared in a more equitable fashion. And in some situations, that means risks that the artist could be taking. Some situations, it'd be risks that the venue could be taking. But using a contract is a way to try to level that playing field. Marla's going to talk a lot about an interesting topic which has to do with intersectional riders, and she's also going to talk a lot about force majeure and what we've learned about force majeure in the 3 years since the pandemic happened. Overall, again, we're talking about a shift. Oops, I don't know what that button does. There we go. Overall, we're talking about a shift away from from a contract that delineates a transaction toward a contract that stipulates the way a relationship functions. Moving toward contracts that recognize the labor that artists do, not the product that they do, but the labor that goes behind that. Guaranteeing that all parties are paid for their work, regardless of the final performance, and an aim to foster community building and trust and long-term equitable working relationships within the cultural sector. That's enough of me jabbering, I think. Why don't we hand it over to Marla? Do you want to talk about payment structures?
Yes. So I'm going to talk about the 3 top-level takeaways. There were many topics discussed in these discussions in the working groups, but in terms of moving the needle and looking at a few things that people do care about a lot to start kind of chipping away with experimenting different clauses, different language, we focused on these 3 topics. So the first I'm going to speak about is payment structures. One of the things that people expressed a lot of dissatisfaction with, and I'm sure no one's a stranger to this issue in this room, is the model of, advance and balance. How much of the deposit or initial payment does the venue, promoter, presenter give at the beginning, and then how much is given at the end? There was discussion around acknowledging the continuous labor done in any engagement, by the whole artist side, and a discussion of essentially breaking up the in advance into several payments that, where possible, could be non-refundable, essentially compensating the artist side for their initial sunk costs. Again, may not be practical for everyone, but there certainly are presenters, and they participated in these conversations, organizations, possibly promoters and venues who want to find ways to help artists gain greater compensation for their work where possible, where financially feasible. And so thinking about how to structure the payment over time, and also look at, invoices of costs, and certainly people already do this to some extent, but in the high volume of transactions and contracts and shows, you don't always have time to get into all the stuff maybe till the end. But if it could be fronted in the beginning and sort of mutually agreed and understood that, hey, we have these certain costs, this is what we're going to spend the money on, and also providing greater transparency on both sides, not only the artist costs, but the promoter side costs as well, in terms of their, underwriting the show. And another thing, when we come back to language, is instead of talking about it as advance and balance, talking about it as just first payment, and getting creative about how to cast these first payments. If you work in an organization where legal or business above your head doesn't want to do something like that, think about making a commissioning payment, discussing with the artist if they're creating anything new for this show, coming up with like a residency payment if that's possible, or reimbursement of expenses as a way of getting them these funds earlier. Some artists start doing work before even the contract comes into play. So it's really about, from the artist side, a lot of this is like feeling acknowledged for the work that really does go in. Of course, a lot of work goes in on the promoter presenter side as well. But there's part of this issue is feeling like no one's really acknowledging all of that and wanting to stretch the payment that may end up being the same at the end of the day, but casting it in a way that can acknowledge some of that early work and, give them a possibility to essentially keep some of it if the show gets canceled, if they've proven that they do put in work. And then other sort of suggestions that came up is around, costs for travel, accommodation, freight, hotels, cancellation insurance, other topic, but, and per diems, that you could just, the normal model of here's a flat fee or here's the money, use it however you want, anything extra comes out of your pocket. Or you could essentially break that down into different cost reimbursements and things that they would be spending it on anyway, but it feels like, you're paying it earlier and helping them to take on those cost commitments. And listing that out as specifically part of the artist compensation in the contract rather than just costs. And let's see. On the other side, making the artist aware, for instance, of the financial impact of booking hotel rooms that they're not going to use without giving proper cancellation notice. Again, I'm not just talking about the artist's issues. There are issues, obviously, on both sides. So we're trying to look at, in these conversations, people bring up both sides of their pain points, you could say. And then obviously some of the downside of rethinking the payment structures is the person sitting who's in the office who's used to giving one early payment and one payment after the show.
Can we move that a little bit so it doesn't pop so much? There you go.
Now they have to keep track of multiple payments throughout the lifetime of a contract or an engagement. So on the promoter, presenter, venue side, again, thinking of a new model that's just easy to do every single time the same way. If a venue, presenter, promoter came up with, look, this is how we do things now. We're giving you payments on these 3 dates. For these, here are the list of benchmarks generally that we expect. If you need to tailor it to your specific show, redline it and send it back, and try to create a standard process for sort of a more involved process. And it can be painful at the beginning, but this is all a work in progress. So we're here to talk about suggesting ways that people who want to go in this direction can think about doing that. Okay, next.
I'm doing it.
Thank you. So here's an example of an actual rethinking of payment structure in practice. Do you want to talk
Yeah, I
about
can
the
do
Mellon Foundation grant?
Yeah, there was a really interesting thing that happened. So all of this kind of, all this discussion was happening in the background and amongst artists and arts organizations. This is going back to 2020, late 2021. And then the Mellon Foundation made $1 million available to the Association of Performing Arts Presenters for commissioning projects. It was totally a pandemic project, but one of the things that they did in the process was they said, look, there have been all these clauses and changes that are being discussed in the contracts for the contracting of the work that artists do, the performances that they make. They said, you can have this $1 million, you can give it, we'll hand it out, but you have to include new contract clauses, the new contract clauses that are being discussed, which was a really fascinating moment, because what it did at a time when this money was crucially necessary was requiring that presenters around the country suddenly have to start rethinking how they do contracts and have to start creating contracts that are more equitable than they had used before. And the effect of that in the legal world and in the presenter's world was this moment of realizing, oh, hang on, this is a time, there's a contract of the future that we're moving toward, and these are the terms that we're going to be seeing in contracts in the future. It's being forced from above. It's being forced by the need for this, grant funding, but it's kind of a window into a direction that contracting could be going.
So the terms that Mellon required was that 50% of the artist fee be paid by the presenter up front, which I know for some organizations sounds, pretty wild, and some not, but, that was the main requirement. And then the balance to be paid on mutually agreed milestones that reflected work done at the time of payment. And that mutually agreed required, discussion, negotiation, cost sharing, and other, issues specific to the show, which again requires some more work, honestly, on both parties' ends. But it's toward this end. And then the artist would need to be paid for more than just the ultimate performance, which again is this way of casting the artist fee to be paid for things that the artist may have done anyway, except for virtual work. Well, virtual work is a new thing that's now part of so many shows. But, this idea of we're paying you to sit here and even negotiate the contract with us. We're paying you for your rehearsal. You can, if you take the time, you can divide up so many things that are happening and sort of acknowledge the work through the payments instead of just here's the fee. So that's the payment structure rethink. The next issue, as Matthew brought up earlier, is the intersectional rider. So the intersectional rider it's kind of a broad topic, but there are so many issues coming up now that artists and venues, promoters and presenters are having to address, are concerned about, the discussion about the values that, the industry aspires to be going towards, and how to allow that to be put into writing. So these are all about generally creating a safe and mutually respectful working environment for all parties and making people feel welcomed under a big tent rather than entrenching antiquated assumptions and norms, which, is the criticism of the way things have always been done. So an intersectional rider doesn't have to be on any given topic. These are just examples that came up in the working groups that people explored and expressed concern about. Accountability for bullying, sexual harassment. How do you do that in your contract? How do you promise an artist that won't happen, But you may not be able to promise and guarantee that, but you can at least address the issue in a reasonable way by stating in your contract that you require staff training, actually doing the staff training, having a reporting mechanism that's stated, and it shows that you care and that you're planning around this topic at a minimum, not that you can prevent or control anything from happening. Matthew discussed the decolonization rider that Emily Johnson created, which required, among many other things, an indigenous land acknowledgement in all promotion and presentation of her work. Again, it makes Emily Johnson feel that you're on board with her and supporting the things that she cares about and helping the cause that she cares about. And that doesn't seem like a hard thing to do. Another woman who was part of the working group, Alice Shepard of Kinetic Light, she wanted accessibility measures in all of the company's work, from community outreach to marketing to the performance venues such as American Sign Language interpretation, live caption, and again, front of house training and accessible facilities for wheelchair users. I mean, some of these things are already required or normal in many places, but not all. So, choreographer Sean Dorsey wanted gender inclusive practices such as all gender restrooms. Again, these things don't have to be so hard, and it's about coming together and hearing and acknowledging what artists care about, what the values are, and trying to work with them on that. And then instructions on how to report issues as an accountability provision, any issues. And, intersectional riders could be on any topic, but it's about sort of working with the artist on that if they have anything that they particularly care about. Here's another example, a self-education rider. An artist wants to have the venue that they're presenting at do a self-education. Their work is queer-centered, people of color-centered, or within a lineage of indigenous artists, and that the presenter will self-educate before artist's arrival. And the addendum that this artist prepared includes a list of resources and asks the presenter to provide an introduction of staff and company members that includes pronoun usage and name tags if requested at the beginning of load-in. So, although the issue is these things do require additional time on people who don't have any time, but again, this is the direction things are moving. People are trying to figure out how to incorporate more of these practices in their day-to-day and create sort of procedures, policies, job requirements, for people to liaise with artists and make them feel comfortable in your space. So this is the most fun topic, I know, force majeure. Rethinking force majeure. That'll wake everyone up, right? This is not an easy one. Comes up here and there, yeah. A few years of force majeure and, so I'm assuming everyone knows what force majeure means, but just in case you don't, it's a clause that terminates the contract and frees parties from obligations to each other due to unforeseeable circumstances, like acts of God. And this alone was one of the main catalysts for this topic coming to the forefront during the pandemic, as we can all imagine. There's no one way to change force majeure, but the thought is to try to look for ways to do what you can to move things in a more equitable direction where possible. So this kind of goes back to this concept and principle of trying and having a lens of trying to work with your artists to continue the engagement and relationship rather than force majeure, immediate termination, and walking away from the contract. And the concept of actually trying to make both parties whole, which I know that in a relationship where there's repeat players involved, often people do this anyway, but it's not actually required or embedded in the contract specifically. And so the party with more of the power and the dynamic kind of decides, do I want to make an effort to really reschedule or not? Versus like having a requirement to at least try, in good faith try. And think what does each party need to be made whole? What did each party lose in this situation? Both sides always lose some sunk costs. And particularly if it's, rained out and the band is ready, willing, and able to perform, and there's no rain or shine provision, So, again, in this situation where you are at an organization where you want to allow the artist to keep some of the money in a force majeure situation, but you have to work with your institution to do so, that's a little tricky. But, this idea of if you have a clause in there about cost coverage and cost reimbursement, then that can help you justify letting them keep some of that money that they already may have, like a prorated portion of the fee, rain or shine policy. Some outdoor institutions already have this policy where they know a few shows per year, per season are going to be rained out, and they have just decided to eat it and pay the bands no matter what, even if they're standing right next to the stage and they can't perform. Obviously, in force majeure, the big elephant in the room is cancellation insurance, both sides, which it's obvious to say, well, can't you just get cancellation insurance? But we know that it's not as easy as it sounds. Even if you have it, even if you think it's a clear case, they fight you tooth and nail to actually pay on the claim, on the promoter side. And then on the artist side, perennial issue, which has gotten, worse during the pandemic, and I think after, is the artist paying for their cancellation insurance. If it's a more indie level artist. Yeah, it's harder and more expensive. So, pre-pandemic, for an opening band for a big tour, let's say, each band has to get their own insurance. And the smaller band would say, hey, why do we have to pay for this? And then the rest of the production is because, if you want to play with the big people, you got to pay the big money. It might eat the whole cost of your tour, smaller band, but if they require it, they require it. And it's not easy. What? Sorry, what? Festivals? I don't know if festivals get it more easily or not. I'll have to check on that.
Okay.
Thanks, Janice. Janice also was participated in this topic a fair amount. So yeah, I'm not going into insurance in this conversation, but I didn't want to leave it out because it's an obvious part of the conversation. But again, insurance requirement policies vary from shop to shop, so it's hard to, generalize. And then, make it easier on yourselves when it does come to trying to make a claim for insurance by having actual policies for documentation needed. If you're worried that an artist will try to find whatever reason to cancel, make them in the contract provide documentation around certain reasons for claiming it's a force majeure cancellation. And then at least you have a roadmap on some of these issues, such as medical, weather, transportation issues, and other things. So that is force majeure topic.
One of the main things that, from a legal standpoint, was really challenging about the conversations that were being had was that a lot of the people in the arts and music world were talking about their frustrations with contracts, and they were talking about ways that they wanted to use the power dynamic that was being outlined and seemed unfair to artists. It seemed like the just the words that were being used. And I think a lot of the world that's not legal feels this way about legal language, feels that there's a power that's being enforced just simply by the nature of the language that's not very transparent to somebody who's not a lawyer. There's a tension in balancing accessible language with terms of art from a legal standpoint. You've got a term of art, and this has been litigated. And from a lawyer standpoint, like, we like to use the language that we're used to using because we know how it works, versus a whole discussion that was like, we want to talk about, as a lawyer, when you're in law school, the first thing you learn in a contract class is as a contract is an adversarial document. It's there to talk about the adversarial relationship of two parties on either side of a business relationship. And when I was talking with artists and arts organizations early on in this discussion, and I said that to people, everybody's like, that's terrible. That's totally not the point of the relationships that we want to have. We want to be talking about collaboration. We want to be talking about the ways that we're working together, not adversary. And so there was this long period of trying to wrap our heads around, like, what do you do with a legal practice which is fundamentally adversarial and an artistic practice which is supposed to be collaborative? How do you get over that? And a lot of the discussion started focusing on language and how do you create contract language that starts to break down the adversarial relationship that, from a legal standpoint, is expected and pretty much unavoidable. And we started talking about what we referred to as fuzzy language or fuzzy words, words that from the artists and arts organizations were really popular, and they really liked the idea of talking about things like respectful or welcoming or responsive or appropriate or collaborative or communicative. And then the lawyers would be like, what's that mean? Like, define that for me and I'll work with it, but I have no idea what you're talking about. And so the conversation that went on over the following months is like, what do you do with those kinds of words? I'll hand that back to you, Marla.
So exactly. Flexible, constructive, respectful, healthy, responsive, appropriate, collaborative. These words make lawyers want to, redline the whole contract, cross out. But obviously, they're more and more beginning to have meaning, and in our community at large. And the kind of sort of terms of art that we do know already, that we sort of, they've been litigated. Reasonable is a big one. Good faith is another. But folks want to go further than that, and so they could definitely invite unpredictable liability or just open a window that previously was closed. And so the question is, we want to move in this direction, be more ethical, acknowledge an artist's work, and commit to working in a positive manner with them and having a long relationship with them. And how do you square that with the words in the contract? And so the only way really that we've come up with, or the only suggestions we've come up with, is try to define things a little bit more, try to qualify things, try to put non-breach penalties in for a lack of compliance with these sort of new concept words in terms of the legal world. try to define what a respectful negotiation would be for commissioning a work. Put some metrics in, around mutually agreeable benchmarks. And what does mutually agreeable communication mean? An email from both parties saying, yes, I agree. That's fine. Just try to make it something that's useful and practical.
Marla, can I ask a question? You said non-breach. What did you say?
So the concern about putting in fuzzy language is that they could be used by one party to allege that the other side has breached the contract for a lack of respectful negotiation or working environment, or fill in the blank. And so if we want to be using these kind of words that don't have a tried and tested legal and litigation background, then you want to try and specify what does a respectful negotiation mean in this context. And instead of just saying, we commit to a respectful negotiation with the artist, any side can say, oh, you weren't respectful. So that means that any decisions must be mutually agreed by an email from both parties indicating they both agree to whatever the steps that need to be taken are, and things of that nature. What's collaborative mean in a working relationship with the parties? What's a flexible force majeure rescheduling requirement? What does that mean? Does that mean put it in the contract, an extra sentence, that we will commit to rescheduling this show for within X amount of time? It could be 2 years, could be 5 years, could be however long that seems reasonable. And then if you don't do that, then they can allege that that you violated that term of the contract. And you can say that these violation of these terms do not constitute a material breach of the contract as well. So again, we're talking about ideas and suggestions to move forward. We don't have all the answers, but this is what we were discussing here. So the next question that we looked at was, okay, so besides certain clauses and certain concepts that we talked about, like force majeure clause, payment arrangement, etc., where in a contract can these values be communicated and without, making the whole contract have, an unacceptable amount of new liability or vagueness, which creates liability through these new fuzzy language terms? So one of the things we talked about was doing a cover letter. Does a cover letter, work to sort of communicate the values of the organization and what they want this contract to represent? But then the contract stays out as it was or has a few changes. I mean, it's okay, but it's sort of it's not binding. Is it binding if it's a cover letter? We don't think so, but could somebody try to allege that it would be, and then the promoter or venue presenter would be caught really off guard? Because if you think you're putting it in a cover letter that's not binding, you can talk about all the things you care about, but not actually have to be held accountable for them all, versus making small changes that you can become held accountable for and that you want to be. So sort of a middle ground could also be putting them in the recitals at the beginning of the contract. So it is more part of the contract, or the intent is clear, although enforceability may be limited, and at least it's part of the contract. And what I have to say about that is, while the goal of this work is to eventually create new terms of art that facilitate more equitable contracts, the reality is that we're not there yet. And so at least getting them inside the four corners of the contract is a good start, if not further, and in these provisions I discussed at the very least. And so they can be referred to when determining the intent of the parties, and hopefully over time they will attain the status of terms of art, like reasonable and good faith. I'm not going to go through this, but in the materials, there's a sample glossary of terms. When I talked about definitions and defining terms and provisions, and some suggestions for language around that, and just some information around the meaning of legal words, legal terms of art.
That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And now we're at
Thank
the
you.
conclusion. 4 minutes left. So.
We're timing it perfectly. It's all working out. So as you can see, this is not like a settled area of law. We're talking about this simply because it is an open, like it is a question that has been asked. I think to me it's interesting because the clients that we've had that raise these issues fall into two categories. It's venues or arts organizations that have an honest commitment to trying to figure out how to do their work better. And it's also arts organizations or venues that are scared that they're going to get called out for something. Recently, we got contacted by a venue that was having trouble because it became clear that they hadn't really looked at their streaming contract, the aspect of their contract that related to streaming, the live performance of their artists, and suddenly an artist was tweeting about how horrible their contract was because it hadn't really, because it was what it was saying, what it was claiming for the venue was totally not fair, and they weren't even aware that it was in the contract, and they came to us saying, what should it look like? What would have been better? What would have gotten us not tweeted about if we'd had a more equitable clause about the requirements? So it's interesting because I think you can look at this from a cynical side, or you can look at it from a positive side. The positive side is like, how can we do our work better? How can we create better spaces? Or you could look at it from a cynical side, which is like, how do we not get in trouble? But in either case, the answer is still the same thing. How do we move using language? How do we move the practices around contracting into a place where the values that we have or that we aspire to have are reflected in the contracts that we use to define the relationships that our whole industry works on? That's sort of what we had to talk about. That's probably it.
Looking ahead, challenges, getting buy-in from your organization for an equity-driven contract. How do we do that? Do we invite a running list of presenters to sign a petition or sign on to a document or set of principles? What role do funders play in this conversation? We talked about how Mellon impacted the arts industry by virtue of the requirements of their grant. And what about other funders becoming involved in this conversation about equity and justice in the field and get them engaged? And, coming together from multiple roles in the field and multiple pain points that sometimes are diametrically opposed is challenging. But people who want to move their organizations forward in this way have to put in some time and thought and creativity into, taking a stab at some of these clauses and changing some things and seeing how it goes, and sort of changing their lens in terms of working with artists. That's really the way forward.
Oops.
And these are some of the organizations that we discussed. Also want to give a special thanks to Janice Shen in the back of the room because she was heavily involved in this topic as well.
And Mike, who's right there as well.
And
We were mucking through all this together.
Oh, okay. Yes.
All right, that's it. Thanks, guys. If you have questions about it, there's a lot of materials in the packet if you didn't get the packet. A lot of the history is listed there. But otherwise, and if you're... Yeah. Yep, we can do that. Absolutely. All right, thank you all. Appreciate your time.